In the aftermath of Rome's unification of Italy and its rise as a Mediterranean power, the question of governance became not merely one of municipal administration, but of imperial control. The Roman Republic, lacking a bureaucratic state in the modern sense, delegated the administration of its expanding territories to former magistrates, men who had already held the consulship or praetorship, entrusted with what was termed imperium. These men, appointed as proconsuls or propraetors, functioned as the supreme civil and military authorities within their provinces. This form of administration was not born out of deliberate institutional design, but emerged pragmatically from Rome's own political mechanics. Offices in Rome were annual and collegiate, designed more for restraining internal power than for effective rule abroad. Yet when transferred to the provincial context, these same structures allowed for the near-absolute authority of one man over vast populations. The governor was, in effect, a monarch for the duration of his tenure, constrained neither by regular judicial oversight nor by local accountability. The Senate, while technically the supervisory body of the provinces, acted more as a council of peers than a regulating institution. It rarely held governors to account. Instead, it distributed provinces to its own members as rewards, a form of senatorial patronage masquerading as republican delegation. A successful military campaign could bring not just glory, but significant personal enrichment, and the governance of a wealthy province was often seen as the capstone of a senator's career. There was no permanent Roman presence embedded in provincial administration, no corps of civil servants, no standing authority apart from the governor and his immediate entourage. The apparatus of power moved with him. His coercive advisors, lictors, scribes, and financial officials followed him from Rome, temporarily occupying the local civic structures. Once his term expired, so too did his regime. Another Roman, with little or no local knowledge, would arrive to begin anew. Such a model ensured continuity only in form, not in substance. It was government by rotation, reliant on personal conduct and the ethics of an elite whose primary loyalty was to their order, not to the provinces they ruled. The state, in this respect, remained narrowly Roman. It governed its empire through aristocratic patronage, not administrative integration. The effects of this would echo across the Republic's history, shaping both the experience of those under Roman rule and the character of the ruling class itself. To understand the nature of Roman provincial governance, one must reckon with its essential character. It was exploitative by design. The provinces were not incorporated into the Republic as equal partners in a shared political project. They were subordinated territories, sources of wealth to be drawn upon for the benefit of Rome, and particularly for the Roman aristocracy. At the center of this system stood the governor, a man often more interested in securing personal enrichment than in administering justice or maintaining stability. Once appointed, he possessed near total autonomy within his province. There were no effective institutional checks. He was judge, treasurer, commander, and representative of Roman authority, all in one. And while Roman law theoretically applied to Roman citizens in the provinces, for the vast majority, the provincial subjects, there was little legal protection against abuses. Extortion became routine. Governors levied contributions under pretexts ranging from security to ceremonial obligation. They extracted bribes to render decisions in court, awarded contracts to associates in exchange for favors, and requisitioned supplies under coercion. The law forbidding such conduct existed, but enforcement was virtually non-existent. Charges of misrule had to be brought back in Rome, where the accused could rely on the solidarity of their class, the inertia of procedure, or the silence of those too afraid or too poor to travel across the sea to testify. But the governor was only one part of the machinery. The publicani, private Roman corporations, or individuals licensed to collect taxes, were arguably more feared. They bid for the right to extract tribute and, having paid in advance, were incentivized to squeeze every possible denarius from the land. Backed by the authority of Rome but driven by private gain, their methods often surpassed even the governors in severity. For the provincials, there was no refuge. They were not merely governed, they were preyed upon. Roman administration, as Mommsen makes clear, operated without a sense of fiduciary responsibility. The provinces were not ruled with a vision of order or development. They were harvested, and the proceeds, whether in grain, bullion, or human labor, flowed back to the capital, where they sustained the opulence of the elite and underwrote the political contests of an increasingly venal republic. Under Roman dominion, the distinction between citizen and non-citizen was not merely symbolic. It was juridical, and it was profound. The administration of justice in the provinces reflected and reinforced this hierarchy. Roman citizens retained certain procedural protections, and in theory, they could appeal to Rome or seek intervention from higher authorities. Provincials, by contrast, stood exposed to the unchecked will of the governor, who served simultaneously as executive and judge. The provincial governor was not subject to any permanent court or auditing body within his province. When legal disputes arose, especially those involving tax collection, property claims, or accusations of sedition, the governor adjudicated them directly. In most cases, his verdict was final. There was no right of appeal unless the accused was a Roman citizen, and even then, exercising that right meant embarking on an arduous, often impracticable journey to the capital, one few provincials had the means or courage to undertake. Moreover, the governor's decisions were not constrained by a codified provincial law. While Roman jurisprudence existed in abundance, its application was erratic, subject to the discretion and temperament of the man in office. Legal predictability, the cornerstone of stable governance, was absent. Instead, judicial outcomes were often determined by influence, bribery, or the governor's private interests. Those with connections to Roman traders, equestrian investors, or senatorial clients might secure favorable treatment. Others had little hope beyond submission. This systemic inequality gave rise to a political economy of fear. Legal redress was available in name, but in practice, justice was commodified. Those able to pay might buy a hearing. Those unable were left to endure. The publicani, who often acted as plaintiffs in disputes over unpaid taxes or debts, were notorious for using the legal system to extract punitive settlements from local communities. With the governor as both arbiter and ally, they operated with near impunity. In effect, Roman law in the provinces was not a universal order, but a tool of domination. It maintained peace insofar as it deterred resistance, but it did so by emphasizing the legal superiority of Rome and the absolute subordination of its subjects. Mommsen reveals a structure that offered no real concept of civic equality or shared legal norms, only a stark division between rulers and ruled, maintained by the unilateral authority of a distant republic. The economic impact of Roman provincial governance was neither incidental nor collateral. It was intrinsic to the system itself. Provinces existed, from the perspective of the Roman ruling class, to be sources of revenue. Far from fostering local prosperity or mutual exchange, Roman administration imposed a fiscal burden that strained regional economies and undermined their autonomy. At the core of this structure was a pattern of extraction. Provinces were required to pay tributum, a general tax that might be assessed in money, kind, or both. This levy was not proportionate to local capacity, but was often based on what the Roman authorities, either governors or the publicani, believed could be extracted without immediate revolt. The process lacked transparency and frequently involved overestimation, manipulation, or outright coercion. Cities and rural communities, compelled to meet their quotas, found themselves caught in a relentless cycle of debt and dispossession. The publicani, operating as tax farmers, exacerbated this condition. Their contracts obliged them to remit fixed sums to the Roman state, and anything collected beyond that became profit. This gave rise to a predatory mode of collection. Peasants were harassed for arrears, entire districts were fined collectively, and judicial pressure was used to secure payments. The line between fiscal policy and economic violence blurred, often vanishing entirely. Moreover, provinces were expected to supply Rome with grain and other vital resources. Egypt, Sicily, and North Africa became key contributors to the Annona, Rome's grain supply system. In times of scarcity, provincial grain was requisitioned at fixed prices or without payment, leaving local populations vulnerable to famine. The same principle applied to materials needed for Roman armies or construction projects, all under the pretense of imperial necessity. Local economies, once diverse and regionally self-sustaining, were increasingly distorted to meet Roman demands. Instead of cultivating crops or crafts suited to regional use, communities were incentivized or compelled to produce what Rome required. Trade was dominated by Roman merchants. Investment flowed to Roman speculators, and financial instruments like loans were wielded to ensnare provincial elites in cycles of dependence. Mommsen notes that while cities retained nominal self-government, their fiscal policies were subordinated to Roman interests. Municipal budgets were absorbed by tribute obligations. Civic life withered under the weight of imposed levies. The wealth extracted from these distant lands did not circulate back into local infrastructure or public goods. It flowed toward Rome, financing aristocratic ambition, electoral bribery, and the ever-growing costs of Roman military and administrative grandeur. This economy was not a network of integrated parts, but a hierarchy of depletion. The provinces sustained the republic's imperial aspirations, but at a mounting cost to their own cohesion, resilience, and dignity. The ideology of Roman imperialism often presented itself in the language of civilization. Rome did not merely conquer, it claimed to enlighten. Provinces were portrayed as beneficiaries of Roman order, Roman law, and Roman culture. Yet, as Mommsen makes clear, this rhetoric obscured the underlying reality. Roman governance was not concerned with the elevation of its subjects, but with their pacification and utility. In theory, Romanization offered a cultural framework through which provincials might assimilate and eventually share in the prestige of Rome. Latin language, Roman dress, Roman institutions. These markers were held up as symbols of advancement. But in practice, this assimilation was tightly controlled and strategically distributed. It was not the population at large that experienced inclusion, but a narrow band of local elites, co-opted into the system to serve as intermediaries. These elites were often granted privileges, citizenship, legal exemptions, or commercial contracts. Their loyalty was rewarded, but their authority remained derivative. They governed their communities in Rome's name, collecting taxes, maintaining order, and transmitting Roman decrees. In return, they gained access to Roman status, while distancing themselves from the people they nominally represented. For the broader provincial population, there was no educational mission, no widespread cultural investment, no effort at institutional development beyond what was necessary for extraction and control. Roman roads facilitated military movement and trade, not communication or integration. Roman cities, often built atop older local foundations, were centers of administration and exploitation rather than shared civic life. The illusion of civilizing governance thus served to justify domination. Roman provincial rule did not cultivate civic participation or intellectual development. It maintained hierarchy and subdued dissent. Cultural influence, where it spread unevenly and instrumentally, often alongside the instruments of coercion. Mommsen is unambiguous. The so-called benefits of Roman rule were not organically transmitted but imposed, and their primary function was not to develop the provinces but to serve the convenience of the ruling power. The civilizing claim, repeated for centuries, was less a policy than a mask, a legitimating myth that concealed the true mechanics of subjugation. The systemic exploitation of the provinces was not without consequence for the Roman Republic itself. The vast inflows of wealth from conquered territories, plunder, taxes, tributes, and private fortunes amassed through governorships did not simply stabilize the state. They reshaped its internal dynamics, often for the worse. Mommsen underscores that this wealth did not circulate broadly within Roman society. It flowed overwhelmingly into the hands of the senatorial and equestrian orders. The political elite, enriched by their provincial commands, became increasingly detached from the economic realities of ordinary Roman citizens. Land ownership expanded into vast latifundia, purchased with profits from provincial taxation and worked by slaves acquired through conquest. Smallholders in Italy found themselves unable to compete, their properties absorbed into aristocratic estates. The Republic's political institutions, conceived for a city-state, proved ill-suited to govern an empire. The Senate, nominally the supreme governing body, became the guardian of a self-perpetuating oligarchy. Elections, once competitive and subject to civic scrutiny, devolved into contests of wealth. The capacity to fund games, distribute grain, or bribe voters depended increasingly on fortunes made abroad. Provincial plunder became the currency of domestic power. This created a feedback loop. The more an ambitious politician enriched himself in the provinces, the greater his influence in Rome. The greater his influence in Rome, the more likely he was to be awarded further commands abroad. Public office became not a duty, but an investment. Governance gave way to speculation. Meanwhile, the structural neglect of the provinces fostered resentment and instability. Injustice, when sustained over generations, produced not merely discontent but rebellion. Local revolts, while sporadic, signaled that the imperial edifice rested on brittle foundations. Rome had created a dominion of subjects, not allies, and coercion had to substitute for consent. At home, the consequences were no less corrosive. The Republic became dependent on its own imperial excesses. The army, increasingly drawn from the dispossessed, became more loyal to generals who promised land and spoils than to the Senate. Ambitious commanders, backed by soldiers and financed by provincial wealth, began to challenge the authority of the state itself. The very engine of conquest had begun to destabilize the institutions it was meant to serve. Mommsen's analysis makes plain that the Republic's decline was not simply a result of political ambition or popular unrest. It was the logical outcome of a system that prioritized exploitation over integration, personal gain over civic duty, and domination over justice. The imperial machine had no mechanisms of correction. It could only accelerate until it broke. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.